This lecture is going to cover family patterns and trends. So let's take a closer look at the family environment. Why do we think that the family environment matters so much? Why do we need to examine this? After all, if we're working in an early learning setting, what would be the emphasis on this? Well, the family does matter very much, of course, for the child. We know that parent and family features are 2 to 3 times more strongly linked to child development than even child care during the preschool years. And it's funny because some of us may sometimes feel, I've heard people say, oh, but they're with us from 6 in the morning until 6 at night. But even so, parent and family features are the most influential in a child's development. But it is also true that we matter quite a bit. And so you have this opportunity for indirect influences that impact these other things, such as the relationships even within the families. Warm and supportive relationships within the family are associated with positive child and adolescent outcomes. Conversely, coercive and conflictual relationships are associated with the development of problems. And schools have an important role in this because the way that we interact with parents, letting them know about, let's say, developmental expectations and the normal things that you would see with, let's say, 2-year-olds or 4-year-olds, that's information that parents take away with them and consider as they're interacting with their children. And sometimes even the the things that they perceive in their kids are impacted by things that they see at school, the expectations at school or feedback from teachers. It's very important to have positive relationships in these ways because it supports families and it supports children. And as we go on in this lecture, we'll keep coming back to that theme. How are we supporting the families? How are we supporting the children? And what can we do to understand families a little bit better so that we can do that? So one of the first things that we want to really think about are the different family forms that are present in society today. This list that I have here is certainly not an exhaustive list. There are ever-changing family forms, but in any case, it's not always just two heterosexual parents with 2 children and a white picket fence. In fact, that's not really representative of who all of our families are. We have increasing numbers of single-parent families, which could include divorced parents, never married parents, widowed parents. We have GLBT families, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered families. So you can have children who have one parent who is a single parent and also identifies as gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgendered. You could have 2 same-sex parents raising children together. You can have families that are even child-headed with siblings, where you have an oldest sibling that has taken on responsibility for their younger siblings because something else has gone on with the family, death, incarceration, drug involvement, or for some reason that parents are not taking care then of those younger siblings and they're with the oldest sibling. We have increasingly grandparents raising grandchildren. This is another example of a family model that is created frequently through stressful circumstances like child-headed with siblings. Generally, grandparents raising grandchildren are doing so because their own children or the adults of the grandchildren are incarcerated or have passed away or are deployed. You can have extended family living in homes. During times of economic downturn, that's increasingly present. There can also be cultural values associated with having grandparents living in the home with parents and children. Step or blended families. Step families and blended families are interchangeable terms, but they do have many different forms. You can have a step family where it's one person, let's say a dad that has moved in with mom and her kids. You can have, kind of the reverse of that, where you have a mom that has moved in with dad and his kids. You can have a blending where you've got, let's say, mom and dad and his kids and her kids. You can have mom and dad, his kids, her kids, and then their own kids. And all of these things create very unique and interesting family dynamics that you can look at. And that's just with heterosexual families that are step and blended. So there's such an array of possibilities when you really think about how families are coming together and the unique things that children might be experiencing. Adopted and foster families and heterosexual two-parent families, there certainly are heterosexual two-parent families also. But we need to be aware that there are many different family forms, as I said. Okay, this slide looks at some of the data from Census 2000. We don't have the data for this particular grouping from Census 2010 just yet, although we probably will, but that's why you're looking at data from 2004. And you can see when you look at this that there are children living in a lot of different arrangements, and it's broken down for you there in a graphical way. So we have to ask ourselves, how then do we define family? If we said, gosh, you can have all of these different family forms, who is family? What does that mean? Well, we know families have always existed, but they've not always looked the same in all places at all times, of course. And we have different bases of definitions. We have biological bases of definitions. That's pretty clear. It's everybody can identify with what that means. You can have definitions that are based on our roles and structure, some of the things that we take on in relationship to our family structures. You can have bases of definition that are based on emotional or affective aspects. So, for example, you could have an aunt that's more like a mother to you because that aunt plays a really important role in your life, and that has an emotional or affective aspect to it too. Sometimes when we look at our families, we'll see that even people in the same role do not always have the same, let's say, emotional tie. You may have a grandparent that you're closer to and feel more emotionally attached to than another grandparent, for example. And then there are interactional patterns. So um, for example, I'm much older than my youngest sibling, and so some of the ways that we would interact with each other would take on a different quality than he would have with my younger sister or I would have with my younger sister. So these things are also, they kind of impact how we perceive one another or how we would define one another. I have said before that I think that my youngest brother was almost like my first child, even though I was never his parent. I didn't have, legal responsibility or anything for that. But when we think about our patterns of interactions, that also, it impacts our behavior with one another. And of course, there are legal definitions of family. We all know what that means. And then there are household definitions of family. Sometimes we take on roles or behaviors related to our householders that live with us. And sometimes that can even create definitions of family. So let's say if my husband's family moves in to our home, I might start to interact with them in a different way and might even on forms take responsibility for them, or they might take responsibility for me in ways that we wouldn't if we weren't sharing the same household. So again, there are many different bases of definitions in terms of how we define family. So biological, as I started off saying first, is very clear, but sometimes you even have biological ties with people who do not consider themselves to be family. We see this oftentimes when folks remarry and you have half siblings that don't really consider themselves to be family, for example, um, or um, a child who doesn't consider their biological parent to be their parent because they didn't spend that much time with them, and they consider someone else that they're not biologically attached to and maybe not even legally adopted by, but they consider that person to be their parent because of the role and the interactional pattern and the emotional pattern, even if it's not a legal parental role. Here's how the U.S. Census Bureau defines families. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, a family consists of a householder and one or more other persons living in the same household related to that householder by blood, marriage, or adoption. Now we're going to compare this to the United Nations definition. Now the UN definition is much broader. The UN definition is listed for you here. The family is technically defined as any combination of two or more persons who are bound together by ties of mutual consent, birth and or adoption or placement, and who together assume responsibility for, inter alia, the care and maintenance of group members, the addition of new members through procreation or adoption, the socialization of children, and the social control of members. So let's look at some of the top trends when we think about who families are today. Well, we know that fewer couples are getting legally married. So we have increased rates of cohabitation and parents that are raising children that maybe were never legally married. More couples are breaking up, so cohesion of relationships, whether married or non-married, is certainly on the increase. Families are definitely getting smaller. There was a time when having, let's say, 7 or 6 children might not have seemed unusual, and a generation ago even having 4 kids was not even that unusual. But in today's world, having 4 kids stands out a little bit, so you see families are getting smaller. 2 kids, 1 child, 3 kids seems almost like a big family. It gets sort of the same reaction that maybe folks would have gotten if they had 6 kids in the 50s or 60s or 70s. So families are definitely getting much smaller. Children are experiencing more transitions in terms of family structures as as families as couples break up. Well, generally what happens is that those members of that couple do often find someone else. It's very rare for people to get divorced, let's say when they're in their 30s or 40s, and then decide, well, I'm going to live alone forever. Many people do remarry. They do or do find someone else, and not all of those unions will then endure. So children are experiencing, in general, more transitions in terms of who are their family members. When you think back a few slides and we talked about looking at household and interactional patterns and roles, there are just more transitions in those things for many children. We do know in terms of trends that men are doing a lot more in terms of housework and things like that, but women still do most of the juggling in a heterosexual relationship. They still do more of the what we call care work. So things like making sure that everybody's got their vaccinations, their flu shot, their dental appointments, their supervision during a snow day, their homework, and the dishes in the dishwasher. That tends to, women tend to take on more of that type of work. We also know that inequality is worsening. The level of child poverty has certainly increased, and that's a stress for families. Multiple earner families are now the norm. There was a time where there may have been an expectation to have a stay-at-home mom, but many people report that that is just not, it's not the norm. If you look at the statistics, you can see that increasingly women are in the workforce. And when I teach face-to-face sections of CHD 216, or frankly of any class, and I ask, well, how many of you might have stayed home with a parent who was home? There are some people that will raise their hand, but when I ask how many people expect to stay home with their own young children, very few people raise their hand. And our area, Washington, D.C., is very expensive to live in, and multiple earning families are often the norm. Now, what I hear folks say when they talk about staying home is that they hope that they can stay home when their children are very young, but very few people expect to stay out of the workforce for the bulk of their adult lives. So multiple earner families are certainly the norm. We also know that the future will have more aging families. People are having children at a later age, and we have a growing boomer population. So with those two things combined, you would definitely say the future has, just in general, families that are older, more aging families. People are living longer, and they're having children later, and all of those things have kind of economic constraints sort of attached to them in terms of how long people work and how old they are when they get married and how old they are when they decide to have children. So all of that put together means we'll have more aging families in general. Um, Other trends in families, in general, we're going to have more single people, more folks that decide to stay single. There was a time that marriage was viewed as the stepping stone to adulthood and kind of the beginning of adulthood. And now it's considered to be almost like a marker for, well, now I have arrived. Now I have attained adulthood, um, and now I am ready to graduate into some next phase. So um, the shift in thinking has certainly resulted in more single people. And economic constraints and any downturn, we see that sometimes folks will delay marriage. We have more folks cohabiting, more single parents, more communal living. In other words, folks kind of sharing a home that may not necessarily intend to always live together in that home forever, um, or different groupings of families coming together. We see families that have fewer children, later marriage, and later childbearing. As I mentioned before, we have smaller families. The birth rate today is 1.8 children per family. In 1960, it was 3.1 children per family. It's interesting because smaller family size is related to certain positive outcomes in the research, like higher IQs, better academic performance, higher levels of education, and less antisocial behavior. This does not mean automatically that people from smaller families are born smarter. It's just that what happens, what really is happening in this kind of statistical analysis is that it kind of bears out an economic truth. And the economic fact is that the more children you have, often large families end up being less well off economically. And if you're less well off economically, you do not have as many resources in terms of not just money, but also time and energy to be able to sit down and help everyone through all of their interests. If you have, let's say, one child, and you have economic resources and you have time and you have energy, and that child says, well, I'm really interested in paleontology. I like dinosaurs. And that person can say, oh, that's called, the parent can say, oh, well, actually, that's called paleontology. Maybe you'd like to be a paleontologist. Let's go to the museum. And I found this summer camp and I found this workshop and here's a book. And, there's kind of a different dynamic sometimes that, it's just, in some ways, sometimes it's easier to give what you have to fewer people. And so how this and again, it's more dramatic when you see that there's an income aspect to it. When you have very large families that have lots of resources, it's not really so dramatic. But in any case, we do see that larger families are generally less well off economically, and usually as a result of that, those children might not always have um, the best opportunities in terms of academic performance and lots of support at home to get their peak academic performance and the higher levels of education, because you have to, you can't necessarily, if you come from a large family, rely on lots of help for that. And so we do see that. And of course, as I mentioned before, we have increasing numbers of dual career families.